Welcome to History Unraveled. Imagine a world where the irresistible allure of a single commodity could ignite a war between two vastly different empires, a conflict that would not only reshape their destinies, but also cast a long shadow across the globe.
It's a powerful image.
Today, we're plunging into the depths of the First Opium War, a clash between the mighty British Empire and the, seemingly impenetrable Qing Dynasty of China.
All right.
You've given some incredibly detailed material to work with, and our mission is to navigate through the historical accounts and uncover the true forces at play in this pivotal moment.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack here.
What fundamental misunderstandings, what economic pressures, and what sheer acts of will led to this dramatic confrontation? Let's find out together.
We have an extraordinary amount of detail here, and what strikes me immediately is the sheer complexity of the situation unfolding over decades. It's not a simple story of one event leading directly to another.
No, definitely not linear.
We need to delve into the intricacies of trade, diplomacy, and societal shifts on both sides to truly grasp why this war became almost, inevitable, or at least highly likely.
Right.
For you, the listener, our aim is to go beyond the well-known facts and understand the deeper currents that propelled these two giants towards conflict.
Okay, let's set the stage. We need to travel back in time, well before the first cannon shot echoed across the Pearl River, to understand the initial dance of trade between these two worlds.
What's fascinating to consider is that the Qing Dynasty, having firmly established its rule and brought Taiwan under its control in the 1680s, actually loosened some of the tight restrictions on maritime trade.
Oh, really? That's surprising.
Yeah, it might surprise you, given what's to come. Guangzhou, or Canton as the Europeans called it, with its geographical advantage and long history of interaction with foreign merchants, quickly rose to prominence as the primary port for international commerce with China.
Okay, so a period of slightly more open trade first.
Relatively speaking, yes.
But then that gave way to the much more restrictive Canton system, which dominated interactions for over a century. Can you paint a picture of what that system looked like for our listener?
Imagine, if you will, all foreign trade funneled through a single city, Guangzhou. And within that city, foreigners could only conduct business through a select group of officially sanctioned Chinese merchants known as the Kuhong.
The Kuhong, right.
They were essentially confined to a specific area, the 13 factories, and here's a detail that really brings it home. They were even forbidden from learning the Chinese language.
Forbidden? Wow.
Think about the immense hurdles that created for building understanding or even just negotiating effectively.
It's almost unbelievable in today's interconnected world. And there were these prevention barbarian ordinances in place. A rather blunt name, wouldn't you say?
Yes, blunt is one word for it.
What was their purpose?
That name certainly reflects the Qing perspective at the time. These ordinances were the legal framework that upheld the Canton system. They were designed to strictly control and limit all contact between Qing subjects and these barbarian outsiders, reinforcing a hierarchical worldview.
China at the center?
Yeah.
Everyone else kept at arm's length.
Exactly, where China was at the center and foreign powers were to be kept at arm's length. For you, the important thing to understand is that this wasn't just about trade regulations. It reflected a deep-seated cultural and political stance.
And within this tightly controlled system, the Kuhong held significant sway, didn't they?
Absolutely. The Kuhong held the power to appraise the value of all foreign goods, decide whether to purchase them, and crucially set the prices for highly sought-after Chinese exports like tea, porcelain, and silk.
The goods Europe couldn't get enough of.
These were the treasures that Europe, particularly Britain, desperately craved.
And this insatiable European appetite for Chinese goods led to a major problem for them, a significant trade deficit, with silver constantly flowing eastward.
Precisely. European powers were buying far more from China than they were selling. They yearned for Chinese tea to quench a national thirst for the delicate beauty of porcelain and the luxurious feel of silk.
And paying mainly in silver.
And the primary way to pay for these goods was with silver, leading to a considerable drain on European treasuries. So you can see how this economic imbalance was creating a growing pressure point.
Here's where the story takes a dark turn. Against this backdrop of silver flowing into China, the British East India Company stumbled upon a new, incredibly profitable, and ultimately devastating commodity: opium. Tell us how this sinister trade began.
Well, the British East India Company, which held immense power in the region, had been facing declining profits from its cotton trade. This was partly due to the rise of industrial production back in Britain itself.
Right. Factories making textiles cheaper at home.
Exactly. So they needed a new source of revenue, something that the Chinese market would eagerly consume, and they found it in opium grown in their Indian territories, particularly in Malwa and on company-controlled farmlands.
A purely business decision, then.
It was a purely mercantile calculation, it seems, with little regard for the human cost involved.
So they essentially pivoted from selling textiles to pushing a highly addictive drug.
Yeah.
The implications of that shift are staggering.
Indeed. The East India Company established a system of auctions in Calcutta where vast quantities of opium were sold. Private British merchants operating under licenses from the company would then purchase this opium.
And smuggle it into China.
Yes, smuggle it into China. The trade flourished on islands just off the Chinese coast, with Linton Island becoming a notorial hub for this illicit activity.
And how did this illegal substance then find its way into the Chinese mainland, bypassing the Qing's regulations?
A clandestine network of Chinese traders emerged, using fast, heavily armed boats, sometimes called fast crabs or scrambling dragons, to collect the opium from these offshore locations and distribute it inland.
Armed boats, so it wasn't exactly risk-free for them either.
No, definitely not. And what did they use to pay for it? Primarily silver, further exacerbating the already significant trade imbalance, but now flowing out of China. So you see a vicious cycle taking hold. The silver that had flowed in for tea was now flowing out for opium.
What's initially perplexing is that the Qing administration, at least for a time, seemed to tolerate this growing influx of opium. Why didn't they crack down immediately?
In the early stages, there was a degree of pragmatic, albeit short-sighted, acceptance. Some Qing officials viewed opium imports as an indirect form of tax on their own population, enriching corrupt officials along the way.
Ah, corruption playing a role.
And furthermore, the silver that flowed in from the opium trade initially helped Europeans buy more tea, on which the Qing held an export monopoly. So in a purely fiscal sense, some within the administration saw a temporary flawed benefit to the treasury, even as silver began to drain away overall.
A truly Faustian bargain, it seems. But this tolerance couldn't last, surely, as the devastating effects of opium addiction became more apparent.
You're absolutely right. By the early 19th century, the situation began to change dramatically. The social and economic costs of widespread opium addiction became undeniable. Families were ruined, productivity declined.
A real social crisis.
Simultaneously, Western nations, led by Great Britain, grew increasingly frustrated with the limitations of the Canton system. They saw China as a vast, untapped market and yearned for expanded trading rights and direct access to its interior.
Not just Britain, then.
No, this desire was shared by other nations like the Netherlands, Denmark, Russia, and the burgeoning United States. They all wanted a piece of the potential Chinese market.
And Britain's own economic policies back home fueled this push for greater access, didn't they? The adoption of the gold standard, for example.
Precisely. Britain's shift to the gold standard created an even greater need for silver to balance its accounts and fuel its rapidly expanding industrial economy. They desperately needed to increase their exports to China to acquire the necessary silver and gold, and the Canton system stood as a major obstacle.
So multiple pressures converging.
You can see how these global economic shifts were directly impacting the pressure on China. It wasn't just about tea anymore.
So as trade imbalances persisted and the opium issue worsened, Britain tried the diplomatic route, sending a series of missions to negotiate better terms. But these all ended in failure, often quite spectacularly.
Indeed. We have the missions of Lord Macartney in 1793, the Dutch in 1794, the Russians in 1805, and Lord Amherst in 1816, all ultimately unsuccessful.
Why did they fail so consistently?
They failed in achieving their goals of expanding trade and establishing formal diplomatic relations on what the British considered an equal footing. The Qing court simply wasn't interested in changing the existing system or treating foreign powers as equals.
The Amherst mission in particular is remembered for the infamous kowtow incident. Can you remind our listeners what happened there and why it was such a sticking point?
Lord Amherst was expected to perform the kowtow, a deep prostration involving kneeling and touching the forehead to the ground as a sign of respect, or really subservience to the emperor.
Which the British saw as...
The British viewed this as a humiliating act, appropriate only between a subject and their sovereign, not between representatives of equal nations. Amherst's refusal to perform the kowtow was seen by the Qing court as a profound insult, a rejection of the emperor's authority and China's central role in their worldview.
So diplomacy completely broke down over protocol.
Essentially, yes. As a result, Amherst and his entire delegation were swiftly expelled from China. This diplomatic breakdown deeply offended the British government and further soured relations. You can see how these seemingly ceremonial issues reflected fundamentally different worldviews.
And while diplomacy was failing, Britain was also subtly increasing its military presence in the region. Was this a deliberate escalation, or more about protecting their existing interest?
It's likely a combination of factors. Initially, the buildup of British naval strength in southern China was often justified as necessary to combat the rampant piracy in the Pearl River estuary. That was a real problem.
Okay, so some practical reasons.
But the establishment of a permanent British garrison in Macau in 1808, ostensibly to defend against potential French attacks during the Napoleonic Wars, certainly demonstrated a growing projection of British power.
The king must have noticed.
They could hardly have been oblivious to this increasing military presence right on their doorstep.
Meanwhile, the foreign merchant community in Guangzhou was growing, becoming a more assertive and influential presence, especially within the confines of the 13 factories. Names like William Jardine and James Matheson loom large in this period.
They do indeed. Jardine and Matheson, who would later establish the powerful trading conglomerate Jardine-Matheson, became dominant figures. While their businesses included legal goods, they were also deeply involved and immensely profitable in the opium trade.
Particularly Jardine.
Jardine, in particular, gained a reputation for his highly effective smuggling operations and his open disdain for the Chinese legal system. He truly believed he operated outside its bounds, or should be allowed to.
It sounds like a direct challenge to Qing sovereignty and law.
Absolutely. And Jardine, along with Matheson, actively lobbied the British government back home to intervene in China.
Lobbying for intervention.
Yes, even advocating for the use of military force to secure more favorable trade terms and formal diplomatic recognition. This lobbying effort highlights the growing impatience and assertiveness of the British merchants.
And their increasing willingness to challenge Qing authority.
By any means necessary, it seemed.
And it wasn't just about trade and power dynamics. The arrival of Western missionaries added another layer of complexity and potential for conflict, as their religious and cultural beliefs often clash with Qing traditions.
That's a crucial point. While some Qing officials, particularly in places like Macau, with a longer history of foreign interaction, might have been relatively tolerant, others viewed the spread of Christianity and the conversion of Chinese subjects with deep suspicion.
Fear of foreign influence spreading.
Yes, and hostility towards beliefs that challenged Confucian orthodoxy. These cultural and religious differences further strained the already tense relationship.
Then we arrive at the Napier Affair in 1834, which feels like a critical juncture or a direct confrontation that foreshadowed the coming war.
The Napier Affair was indeed a significant failure and a clear indicator of the fundamental impasse. After the British East India Company's monopoly on trade with China was abolished, the British government appointed Lord William John Napier as its chief superintendent of trade.
So a direct government official now, not just the company.
Exactly. But his instructions were a recipe for disaster from the Qing perspective. He was to oversee British trade, including implicitly the opium trade, communicate directly with high-ranking Qing officials.
Bypassing the Kuhong and the established system.
Precisely. Bypassing the established channels of the Canton system. And he was even told to conduct a survey of the Chinese coastline, an act that understandably aroused deep suspicion. Espionage, essentially.
He essentially tried to unilaterally dismantle the Canton system upon arrival, didn't he?
Pretty much. Napier attempted to bypass the Kuhong and write directly to the viceroy, Lu Kun. This was a direct violation of Qing protocol, and the viceroy refused to even acknowledge his letter, seeing him as just a merchant leader, not a diplomat.
How did the king respond?
In September 1834, the Qing authorities responded by temporarily shutting down British trade altogether. Napier's reaction was rash. He ordered British naval vessels to bombard Chinese forts at the Boca Tigris, the mouth of the Pearl River, as a show of force.
A move that must have been seen as an act of outright aggression by the king.
It was, and it was condemned not only by the Chinese government, but also by many within the British trading community who feared it would disrupt their legitimate businesses. Napier's health deteriorated rapidly, perhaps from the stress and climate, and he ordered a retreat.
And he died shortly after.
He died in Macau shortly thereafter. The entire episode was a humiliation for the British government and underscored the irreconcilable differences. Neither side was willing to budge on how they viewed diplomacy and trade.
So a volatile mix of trade imbalances, the insidious rise of the opium trade, failed diplomatic overtures, growing military posturing, and direct confrontations like the Napier affair all led to a breaking point. What was the final catalyst that ignited the war?
Well, the long-term factors we've discussed created a highly combustible environment. As historian Jonathan Spence notes, these included growing social unrest within China itself, the pervasive spread of opium addiction, a hardening anti-foreign stance within parts of the Qing government.
The things we've been talking about.
Exactly. Plus, the fundamental conflict over legal jurisdiction whose laws applied to foreigners, the changing dynamics of international trade, and a decline in the earlier Western intellectual admiration for China. It all added up.
So when the Qing government decided on stricter opium prohibitions,
When the Qing government implemented even stricter prohibitions against opium in 1838, it created a moment of intense crisis, especially for the opium traders whose entire business model was threatened. And there was an oversupply of opium just as these prohibitions hit.
and the fact that the British Superintendent of Trade was now a direct representative of the British Crown dramatically raised the stakes, didn't it?
Right.
An affront to him was now an affront to the entire British nation.
Exactly. That direct link to the crown changed everything. Any perceived insult or obstruction was viewed through the lens of national honor and sovereignty, making military intervention a far more palatable option for the British government back in London.
And this is when Lin Zexu enters the picture.
Yes. In 1839, the Doguang Emperor, finally recognizing the severity of the opium crisis, appointed Lin Zexu as special imperial commissioner. He granted him extraordinary powers to eradicate the opium trade once and for all.
Lin Zexu is often remembered as a figure of immense integrity and determination. His actions certainly set the stage for the direct confrontation.
He was unwavering in his commitment. Famously, he penned an open letter addressed to Queen Victoria, appealing to her sense of morality.
What did it say?
He pointed out the hypocrisy of Britain banning opium within its own borders while profiting immensely from its sale in China. He questioned Britain's claim to be a just nation while perpetuating such a destructive trade. Basically, how can you do this?
A powerful moral indictment. Did Queen Victoria ever even see this letter?
It's highly unlikely it ever reached her. Probably got lost in diplomatic channels or deliberately sidelined. However, the letter itself stands as a testament to Lin's conviction and his attempt, however futile, to appeal to a higher moral ground.
What were his main concerns driving this?
He vowed to eliminate the opium trade at any cost, deeply concerned about its debilitating effects on China's military strength. Soldiers were becoming addicts, and its devastating drain on the nation's silver reserves. The economic argument was huge.
And he didn't just write letters. Lin Zexu took incredibly forceful action, triggering a direct confrontation with the British.
He did. He issued strict edicts banning the sale and use of opium and demanded that all opium merchants, both Chinese and foreign, surrender their entire stockpiles immediately.
A huge demand.
Then he took the drastic step of closing the Pearl River Channel, effectively trapping the British traders and their ships in Guangzhou. Chinese soldiers then boarded British ships anchored in the river and seized over 20,000 chests of opium.
20,000 chests. That's an enormous amount.
It was a fortune, and this seized opium was then publicly destroyed in a dramatic display of Qing resolve at human. They mixed it with lime and salt and washed it out to sea over several weeks.
That act, the destruction of the opium, is often seen as the immediate trigger for the war. How did the British superintendent, Charles Elliot, react to this?
Elliot protested vehemently against what he considered an illegal seizure of British property. He ordered all British ships still carrying opium outside the river to flee the coast and prepare for potential hostilities.
And the merchants stuck inside.
In response, Lin Zexu placed the foreign merchants in Guangzhou under siege within their factories, cutting off supplies and preventing them from communicating with their ships. This further escalated the tension dramatically.
So Elliot found himself in an incredibly difficult position, trying to protect British lives and property while facing the unwavering resolve of Lin Zexu.
Precisely. To resolve the immediate crisis and secure the release of the besieged merchants, Elliot made a momentous decision. He persuaded the British traders to surrender their entire remaining opium stocks to him, acting on behalf of the British government.
Handing it over to Elliot, not Lin directly.
Correct. And crucially, he promised them that the British government would eventually compensate them for their losses.
That's the key point.
This promise, made under duress, would later become a key justification, a casus belli, a cause for war for the British. They argued the government now effectively owned the seized opium.
The very act intended by the king to end the opium trade ultimately provided the British with the grievance they needed to launch a war in its defense. The irony is stark and deeply unsettling.
It is. After the opium was destroyed, trade in other goods was allowed to resume, but under significantly stricter regulations. Lin Zexu attempted to fundamentally reform the system by introducing a new bond.
What was this bond?
It required all foreign merchants and even Qing officials involved in trade to sign it, swearing never to deal in opium again under penalty of death.
Penalty of death? That's serious.
Very. Unsurprisingly, the British government vehemently opposed this. They saw it as an unacceptable infringement on their concept of free trade and an affront to British subjects being subjected to Chinese law in this way.
Did anyone sign it?
Some non-opium trading firms, particularly Americans, were willing to sign the bond to continue their legitimate businesses. But the British government as a whole viewed it as an intolerable demand.
So legal trade resumed, but the opium problem wasn't solved.
Not at all. Despite the resumption of legal trade, the severe scarcity of opium created a lucrative black market. Smuggling operations at Lytton Island and other coastal spots intensified, with corrupt Kahang merchants and other smugglers exploiting the soaring prices.
And Elliot knew about this.
Elliot, fully aware of this continued illicit trade, hesitated to take strong action, probably fearing it would provoke the very war he hoped to avoid. It was a really difficult tightrope walk for him.
Then comes the skirmish at Kowloon in September 1839. This feels like the moment when simmering tensions finally boiled over into open conflict.
Tensions had been steadily rising. There was an incident in July 1839 where drunken British sailors killed a Chinese villager, Lin Weiqi. Elliot refused to hand the sailors over to Chinese jurisdiction, fearing they wouldn't receive a fair trial by British standards.
Another clash over legal systems.
Exactly. This refusal further inflamed the situation. Lin Zexu responded by withdrawing Chinese laborers from Macau who worked for the British and issuing an edict prohibiting the sale of food and supplies to British ships. Rumors even spread of poisoned freshwater springs.
It sounds like a siege mentality was taking hold on both sides.
Indeed. Then, in August, a British ship was attacked by Lascar pirates, possibly encouraged by local officials. It's unclear, leading Elliot to order all British ships to leave the coast for safety.
Where could they go?
Well, at Lin Zexu's request, the Portuguese authorities in Macau barred British ships from their harbor. So by the end of August, many British ships found themselves stranded off the coast, running dangerously low on essential supplies. It was in this context that HMS Volage arrived.
A Royal Navy warship. That changes the dynamic.
It does, and it was the arrival of this warship that led directly to the clash at Kowloon.
How did that happen?
Elliot dispatched 2 armed vessels, a schooner and a cutter, to Kowloon on September 4th, specifically to purchase provisions. The commander of the Kowloon fort refused to allow any local trade following Lin's orders.
So Elliot took matters into his own hands.
Elliot issued an ultimatum, and when it expired, the British ships opened fire on nearby Chinese war junks. The Chinese forces returned fire, and the ensuing Battle of Kowloon resulted in the withdrawal of the Chinese junks after some damage.
Did they attack the fort?
Importantly, Elliot decided against a land attack on the fort itself, apparently to avoid causing harm to civilians. He even circulated a paper in Kowloon explaining his actions and emphasizing his desire was only to trade peacefully for supplies.
But this act of using military force to secure supplies was a clear escalation, wasn't it? And it wasn't the last. Just a couple of months later, we have the blockade of the Pearl River and the Battle of Twempi.
Right. Following the Kowloon incident, Elliot implemented a blockade of British shipping in the Pearl River. His aim, somewhat paradoxically, was to prevent other British ships from following the example of the Thomas Coutts.
What did the Thomas Coutts do?
Its captain had decided to sign Lin Zexu's anti-opium bond directly with the Chinese authorities to resume trade, defying Elliot's authority and potentially undermining the united British front. Elliot wanted to stop that.
Okay, so an internal British conflict spilling over.
Which led directly to the First Battle of Twempi in November 1839. When the Royal Saxon, another British merchant ship, attempted to sail upriver towards Guangzhou, ignoring Elliot's blockade, it was intercepted by warning shots fired from HMS Volage and HMS Hyacinth.
And the Chinese Navy got involved.
Yes. In response, Admiral Guantianpei deployed his fleet of Chinese war junks to protect the Royal Saxon and challenge the British warships.
And the resulting confrontation was a decisive victory for the technologically superior British Navy.
The British warships quickly overwhelmed the Chinese junks. Their cannons were more powerful, more accurate. They destroyed 4 Chinese junks and forced the rest to retreat.
Though the king reported it differently.
While the Qing authorities later issued exaggerated reports claiming a major victory, the reality was a clear, if small-scale, defeat for them. Elliot, fearing retaliation from the Chinese, perhaps using fire rafts against his ships, ordered British vessels to move further down the coast to Causeway Bay, near Macau.
Could they get supplies there?
No. The Portuguese governor of Macau, under pressure from the king, refused Elliot's request to allow British ships to load and unload supplies there. By January 1840, the Daguang Emperor had issued an imperial edict ordering a complete halt to any material assistance to the British. The stage was now fully set for war.
So as these clashes were unfolding in China, how is the situation being perceived and debated back in Britain? Public opinion must have been divided.
There was indeed a significant spectrum of views. While some Britons, and even prominent figures in America like John Quincy Adams later, had long voiced moral objections to Britain's involvement in the opium trade.
The merchants had a different view.
The powerful East India and China Association, representing the merchants, argued fiercely that the British government had effectively sanctioned the trade for years, and therefore had a moral and now legal obligation to compensate them for the losses incurred by Lin Zexu's actions.
Because of Elliot's promise.
Exactly. Elliot signed certificates promising payment for the surrendered opium provided a crucial legal foundation for these financial demands on the government.
So economic interests were a major driving force in shaping British public opinion, or at least elite opinion.
Absolutely. Many Britons also felt a sense of outrage at the perceived mistreatment of British diplomats like Napier and the restrictive nature of Qing trade policies. National pride was definitely a factor.
And the government.
The Whig government under Lord Melbourne was, well, leaning towards military action, and the pro-government press actively portrayed the Qing dynasty as despotic and cruel, framing it as uncivilized resistance to free trade, helping to sway public sentiment in favor of war. Queen Victoria herself addressed Parliament in January 1840, expressing her concern over the interruptions to trade and the injurious proceedings against British officers and subjects in China.
And the domestic political climate in Britain at the time also played a role in pushing towards war, didn't it?
Oh, certainly. The Whig Melbourne government was in a precarious political position, politically weak. The opposition Tory party saw the unfolding China question as a prime opportunity to attack the government's handling of foreign affairs.
Trying to score political points.
In April 1840, Sir James Graham introduced a motion in Parliament that, while carefully worded to avoid directly mentioning war or opium to maximize support, effectively censured the government for its lack of foresight and its handling of relations with China. This political maneuvering added another layer of pressure.
But there were also strong voices within the government, like Lord Palmerston, advocating directly for military intervention. What were his main arguments?
Lord Palmerston, the Foreign Secretary, was a staunch advocate for war, a real hawk on this. He argued forcefully that the destroyed opium was indeed British property thanks to Elliot's actions, and that the Qing government was obligated to provide full reparations.
He didn't buy the moral arguments.
He largely dismissed the moral arguments against the opium trade put forward by the Chinese, framing the conflict instead as a matter of Britain's commercial interests being unfairly obstructed and China's unwillingness to engage in equitable trade and diplomatic relations.
Did he consult with the merchants?
He even consulted directly with William Jardine, the opium kingpin, who painted a dire picture and urged forceful action. Palmerston penned influential letters to Prime Minister Melbourne, explicitly calling for a military response, a punitive expedition.
So it wasn't just about opium, in his view.
Beyond the economic arguments and the opium compensation, there was a strong sense that British national pride had been insulted by the expulsion of merchants, the siege, and the king's refusal to acknowledge diplomatic equality. It was about Britain's standing in the world.
So, despite some moral qualms within Britain, a confluence of economic imperatives, political calculations, and a sense of wounded national pride ultimately paved the way for military intervention. Let's move on to the war itself. What were the initial moves once Britain decided to act?
The Qing government, interestingly, based on their previous experience with the Napier affair, initially believed that the British had been successfully expelled and wouldn't return in force. Sort of wishful thinking, perhaps?
But they weren't really prepared.
Consequently, they made relatively few immediate preparations for a major military response. Their primary concern at the time was actually the potential for conflict with the Sikh Empire to their west. The British, lacking a secure base of operations in China after being kicked out of Canton and Macau, withdrew their merchant shipping but maintained a Royal Navy squadron nearby.
And back in London.
In London, Lord Palmerston issued orders to the East India Company to divert troops from India towards China for what was conceived as a punitive expedition, not initially planned as a full-scale war of conquest.
Who was in charge on the British side?
Charles Elliot remained in charge of British interests on the ground, sort of the political lead. Commodore Gordon Bremer led the Royal Marines and the China Squadron, the naval force, and Major General Hugh Godolphin was later appointed as the commander of the land forces. Crucially, the British government committed to funding the entire military operation. Plans were formulated to target key Chinese ports and rivers.
The British offensive began in earnest in July 1840, with the initial focus on the Zhoushan archipelago, a significant group of islands off the coast near Ningbo. What was the strategic rationale behind this move?
The first part of the British Expeditionary Force, consisting of troop transports, warships, barracks ships, some crucial steam-powered gunboats, and smaller landing craft under Commodore Bremer, arrived off the coast of China in late June 1840.
Did they try diplomacy first?
They promptly issued an ultimatum to the Qing authorities demanding compensation for the destroyed opium and guarantees for future trade. This ultimatum was swiftly rejected.
And Palmerston wanted a base.
Yes, Lord Palmerston's instructions to Elliot and Admiral George Elliot, who was co-commander initially but later replaced due to illness, included the strategic objective of securing the cession of at least one island. They needed a permanent British trading post and naval base.
So Zhoushan was the target.
The combined naval and ground assault on the Zhoushan archipelago commenced in July, with Zhoushan Island and its vital port city of Dinghai as the primary targets.
And the Qing defenses there, while perhaps brave, were no match for the superior firepower and tactics of the British forces.
When the British fleet arrived at Dinghai, Elliot formally demanded the city's surrender. The Chinese garrison commander, displaying remarkable courage, refused, questioning the legitimacy of Britain's aggression.
So fighting broke out.
Fierce fighting ensued. The Royal Navy's heavy guns quickly silenced the Chinese coastal defenses, which were mostly outdated cannons on fixed emplacements. British Marines then landed and captured the strategically important hills south of Dinghai. In the naval engagement, 12 small Chinese junks were destroyed by the more powerful British warships.
And Dinghai fell quickly.
Dinghai fell to the British on July 5, 1840, marking the first major territorial gain for the British in the war. However, the occupation proved difficult initially due to disease and supply issues.
Following the capture of Dinghai, the British seemed to adopt a two-pronged approach, sending one fleet south toward the crucial Pearl River and another north towards the Yellow Sea. What was the thinking behind this division of forces?
After securing Dinghai, the British command decided to split their forces to exert pressure on different fronts. The Northern Fleet, under the command of Admiral Elliot himself, sailed towards the Bohai Sea and up the Hai River, reaching the vicinity of Tianjin, relatively close to Peking.
What was the goal there?
Elliot carried with him that letter from Lord Palmerston addressed directly to the Qing Emperor, hoping to bypass local officials and communicate the British grievances and demands directly to the imperial court. The aim was to shock the court and achieve a swift diplomatic resolution.
And the Southern Fleet.
Meanwhile, the Southern Fleet remained active in the Pearl River Delta to maintain a naval presence in the key trading region around Guangzhou and to potentially secure further concessions there.
How did the king react to this pressure near the capital?
In response to the escalating crisis and the appearance of British ships so far north, the Qing Emperor removed Lin Zexu from his post, blaming him for mishandling the situation. He appointed Qishan, seen as more moderate, as the viceroy of Liangguang, tasking him with managing the increasingly precarious situation in the south.
So negotiations started again.
Negotiations commenced between Qishan and Charles Elliot. An agreement was reached to relocate the primary negotiation efforts back to the Pearl River. Qishan, perhaps playing for time or genuinely seeking compromise, offered to seek imperial funds to provide restitution for the destroyed opium in exchange for the British withdrawing their fleet from the Yellow Sea.
Did the British agree?
Yes. The British fleet withdrew from the north, signaling a potential path towards de-escalation, albeit a fragile one. Both sides were still preparing for more conflict.
So even as diplomatic feelers were being extended, both sides were undoubtedly preparing for the possibility of continued conflict. The arrival of significant reinforcements from India in the spring of 1841, including the formidable iron steamship HMS Nemesis, must have significantly shifted the military balance in favor of the British.
The arrival of these reinforcements was indeed a crucial turning point. The HMS Nemesis, in particular, was a revolutionary vessel for its time. Its iron hull offered better protection, and its steam-powered paddle wheels gave it unprecedented maneuverability and speed, especially in rivers.
Something the King couldn't match.
Capabilities that the Qing Navy, reliant on traditional wooden sailing junks, simply could not counter effectively. It could tow warships against the wind or tide and mount cannons itself.
And this new strength was put to use.
Yes. In August 1841, exploiting their naval superiority, a relatively small British force of 3 warships and about 380 Marines successfully drove Chinese forces from the Barrier, a strategic land crossing separating Macau from the mainland. This victory, largely attributed to the effectiveness of the Nemesis, had a significant impact locally.
How so?
It bolstered pro-British sentiment within Macau and led to the ousting of some Qing officials seen as ineffective. While Portugal officially maintained neutrality, they increasingly allowed British ships to dock and resupply in Macau, providing a vital logistical advantage.
So with their position in the south consolidated, what next?
With their position in the Pearl River Delta strengthened, the British then focused their attention on moving further upriver towards Canton. The Northern Fleet eventually rejoined them at Human, also known as the Bogue, the strategic gateway to Guangzhou, approximately 5 months after their initial victory at Zhoushan.
What was Bremer's objective?
Commodore Bremer's objective was clear: gain control of the Pearl River and Guangzhou itself. He believed this would provide the necessary leverage to force the king to negotiate on British terms and, crucially, to resume trade under more favorable conditions.
The fighting around the Pearl River, particularly the renewed assaults on the Bogue forts, must have been intense, especially after the initial, somewhat limited engagements.
It was indeed. Following the breakdown of those initial negotiations between Elliot and Qishan and the king's refusal to fully concede, the conflict in the Pearl River escalated significantly in early 1841. The British launched a series of determined attacks on the Bogue forts.
Were the forts strong?
They were heavily fortified, formidable by traditional standards, but proved no match for the sustained bombardment from British warships, including the powerful broadsides and accurate fire of vessels like the Nemesis.
More victories for the British then.
The Second Battle of Chwenpi in January 1841 saw the destruction of 11 more Chinese war junks and the capture of key fortifications. This effectively allowed the British to breach the outer defenses of the Pearl River and proceed further inland, blockading the river.
A Qing commander was killed.
Tragically, Admiral Guan Tianpei, the respected and determined Qing commander we mentioned earlier, was killed in action during these intense engagements at the Bogue forts in February 1841, a significant loss for the Qing military effort.
Did Qishan try to negotiate again?
Qishan, witnessing the overwhelming British military superiority and recognizing the vulnerability of the Pearl River Delta, made further attempts to negotiate. This led to the drafting of the Convention of Chwenpi.
What did that propose?
It proposed significant concessions: equal diplomatic rights, the exchange of Hong Kong Island, which the British wanted, for the previously captured Zhoushan, release of prisoners, reopening trade in Guangzhou, and a commitment from China to pay $6 million silver as compensation.
But this proposed agreement, the Convention of Chwenpi, was ultimately rejected by both the King Emperor and Lord Palmerston, leading to a resumption of hostilities and a further escalation of the conflict.
That's a crucial point. The Daoguang Emperor was incensed that Qishan had agreed to cede territory Hong Kong without his explicit imperial sanction. He ordered Qishan's arrest and punishment. He was disgraced.
And Palmerston?
Simultaneously, Lord Palmerston back in London deemed the concessions insufficient. He wanted more trade access, better terms, perhaps legalization of opium implicitly. He felt Elliot had settled too easily.
So the deal collapsed.
As a result, both sides repudiated the agreement. The fragile hope for a negotiated peace evaporated. Hostilities resumed in February 1841, with the British launching further attacks up the Pearl River after the Qing authorities refused to immediately reopen Guangzhou to trade under the terms Elliot thought he'd secured.
What happened next?
The remaining Bogue forts fell to the British in decisive engagements. British naval forces continued their advance towards Guangzhou. The capture of Whampoa, a key anchorage just downstream from the city, directly threatened Guangzhou itself.
Despite these clear British victories, there was a brief lull in the fighting, a temporary truce. But this didn't last, as the Qing forces around Guangzhou were significantly reinforced under a new commander.
Following their advance up the Pearl River and the capture of strategic locations near Guangzhou, the British forces did enter into a temporary ceasefire. This was largely facilitated by the Qing merchants, who desperately sought to protect the city from further destruction and get trade flowing again.
But the Qing used this time.
The Qing government, far from seeking a lasting peace on British terms, used this opportunity to significantly reinforce the military presence around Guangzhou. General Yang Fang, a seasoned commander, arrived with a substantial army, estimated at around 30,000 men.
Preparing for a counterattack.
The Qing forces began to fortify Guangzhou extensively, constructing earthworks, sinking junks in the river to create obstacles, and preparing fire rafts for potential use against the British fleet. They also took measures to cut off food supplies to the British ships.
Did the British react?
This buildup and the clear intention to resist led to renewed tension. After a British ship sailing under a flag of truce was fired upon by Qing forces, the British responded decisively in March 1841. They launched an attack on Guangzhou itself, capturing the 13 factories area and occupying part of the city.
Did they stay in Guangzhou?
Following negotiations, again involving the Qing merchants desperate to save the city, a temporary agreement was reached that allowed for the resumption of trade. The British forces then withdrew the majority of their warships downriver, perhaps satisfied with having made their point.
Then came Yishan, who replaced the disgraced Qishan. His arrival seemed to signal a renewed and perhaps even more aggressive determination from the Qing court to resist the British.
Yishan's appointment indeed marked a shift. While he outwardly declared that trade should remain open, probably to keep funds coming in, his primary objective was to muster a massive military force outside Guangzhou.
How big?
Under his command, the Qing army swelled to an estimated 50,000 troops. The funds generated from the resumed trade were directly funneled into strengthening the city's defenses for a major confrontation.
And the emperor wanted action.
The Daoguang emperor issued a decree ordering Yishan to exterminate the rebellious English barbarians, leaving no doubt about the imperial court's renewed determination. This order, however, was somehow leaked to the British, further inflaming tensions.
So another battle for Guangzhou seemed imminent.
Facing this growing military threat and perhaps internal divisions, Yishan eventually ordered British merchants to evacuate Guangzhou again. British warships returned to more threatening positions. However, before a large-scale battle could erupt, the British strategically shifted their focus northward.
Why move north?
They likely recognized that decisive victories further up the coast, closer to the heart of Qing power, might yield greater leverage in forcing the court to negotiate a comprehensive settlement covering all of China, not just Canton.
This shift of focus to central China marked a significant change in the trajectory of the war, moving beyond the initial theater of conflict in the Pearl River Delta.
Following their strategic withdrawal from the immediate vicinity of Guangzhou, the British forces relocated to Hong Kong, the island ceded to them in the repudiated Convention of Quenpi, which they were now occupying regardless.
A base of operations.
Here, the British leadership engaged in crucial debates regarding their future strategy. Charles Eliot, perhaps weary of the conflict and facing criticism from London, favored consolidating gains and focusing on reopening trade.
But the military commander disagreed.
Major General Goh, the commander of the land forces, advocated for a more aggressive approach. He proposed capturing key coastal cities like Amoy, Ximen, and even a blockade of the vital Yangtze River.
Any setbacks?
British efforts in Hong Kong were temporarily hampered by a severe typhoon in July 1841, which caused significant damage to their ships and shore facilities. It was a reminder of the challenges of operating so far from home.
And there was a change in leadership.
A significant change occurred in August when Sir Henry Pottinger arrived to replace Eliot as the British plenipotentiary and superintendent of trade. Pottinger had a broader mandate, clearer instructions from Palmerston, and was determined to achieve a decisive outcome.
A new naval commander, too.
Yes, Admiral Sir William Parker also arrived to take command of the naval forces, replacing Admiral Senhouse, who had tragically died from fever after the Bogue campaign. Under this new, more aggressive leadership, the strategic decision was made to press the offensive northward, towards the political and economic heartland.
The attack on Amoy in August 1841 demonstrated the continued and arguably widening gap in military technology and tactical capabilities between the British and Qing forces.
Despite the Qing authorities having had some time to prepare defenses around the port city of Amoy, including building quite extensive artillery batteries on the surrounding cliffs,
They still couldn't stop the British?
the combined naval and ground assault launched by the British on August 25th and 26th proved overwhelming. The Royal Navy's bombardment effectively neutralized many Chinese coastal defenses. While some larger British warships struggled to completely suppress the main Qing battery on Galangju Island due to shallow water, British infantry eventually managed to scale the cliffs and capture the positions in fierce fighting.
So Amoy was taken. Did the British occupy it?
Following the capture of Amoy on August 27th, the British forces strategically decided not to occupy the city long-term. Before their departure, they destroyed the main powder magazine and captured a significant number of Qing war junks, 26, and cannons, 128, many of which were spiked or thrown into the river.
Were there orders against looting?
General Go issued strict orders prohibiting looting under penalty of death, reflecting a desire to maintain discipline and perhaps distinguish themselves from pirates. However, many Chinese merchants in Amoy refused British offers of protection, fearing reprisals later.
So the British left.
The British forces withdrew to the nearby island of Gulangyu, effectively blockading the river. In the aftermath, the abandoned city was reportedly looted by various groups, including local bandits and possibly disgruntled soldiers, before Qing forces eventually reoccupied it and, again, claimed a military victory despite their earlier defeat.
The British then continued their northward advance, targeting and capturing the strategically important city of Ningbo in October 1841, further demonstrating their ability to project power along the Chinese coast.
In October, a British naval squadron bombarded and swiftly captured the city of Xinhai, which guarded the entrance to the Yang River leading to Ningbo. This opened the way for a larger assault.
And Ningbo itself.
A subsequent land battle fought near Ningbo resulted in a decisive rout of the Qing forces defending the city. Ningbo fell to the British on October 13th without much further resistance. The capture of an imperial cannon manufactory within Ningbo was a particularly significant blow.
What did the British do with captured goods?
Following the capture, the British command formally established a policy regarding war loot, stipulating that 10% of the value of captured public property would be taken as prize money, partly as retaliation for the costs of the war.
Did fighting stop for the winter?
After securing Ningbo, active fighting largely ceased for the winter months. The British forces focused on resupplying, consolidating their position in Ningbo and Zhoushan, and preparing for the next campaign season.
Were the Qing learning the truth about the defeats?
During this period, local Qing officials, including Yushan down south, continued to send false and misleading reports to the Daeguang Emperor, downplaying the extent of the British threat and claiming fabricated victories. However, these deceptions eventually unraveled as the reality became undeniable. The emperor, finally realizing the gravity of the situation, recalled Yushan and stripped him of his command.
Did Chinese towns start preparing?
Yes. Recognizing the growing threat posed by the British advance, towns and cities across central China began to hastily construct fortifications in a desperate attempt to defend themselves, though often with limited resources and expertise.
The final major phase of the war was the Yangtze campaign in the summer of 1842, which saw the British push deep into the heart of China, culminating in the threat to Nanjing and the signing of the Treaty of Nanking.
In June 1842, the British fleet, now significantly reinforced and well-supplied after the winter, moved up the Yangtze River, a vital artery of China's internal commerce and grain supply, to the capital via the Grand Canal.
Where did they strike first?
Their first major target was the city of Zhenjiang, Xinjiang, strategically located at the crucial intersection of the Yangtze River and the Grand Canal.
Was the battle fierce?
The battle for Zhenjiang, fought on July 21st, was one of the most fiercely contested engagements of the entire war. The Manchu garrison there fought with desperate bravery, resulting in heavy casualties on both sides. House-to-house fighting occurred.
But the British prevailed.
Despite the determined resistance, the superior firepower, training, and discipline of the British troops ultimately prevailed, and Zhenjiang fell. The capture of Zhenjiang was a devastating strategic blow to the Qing Empire.
Why so significant?
It effectively severed the Grand Canal, disrupting the crucial movement of tribute grain and other vital supplies north to the imperial capital in Peking. This put immense pressure on the Qing government.
Where did the British go next?
Following this decisive victory, the British fleet continued its advance up the Yangtze towards Nanjing, one of China's most important historical and cultural centers, and the former southern capital.
Did the king try to defend Nanjing?
The Qing authorities amassed a large army in an attempt to defend the Liangjiang province, where Nanjing was located, and strengthened river defenses along the Yangtze. However, British naval activity further north had already diverted some resources, and morale was low after Zhenjiang's fall.
Any last attempts at peace?
In a desperate attempt to avert a full-scale assault on Nanjing, the Qing commander in Liangjiang released a group of British prisoners captured earlier, hoping this gesture might lead to a ceasefire. However, poor communication and the momentum of the British advance led to the rejection of this overture.
So the British reached Nanjing.
British forces reached Nanjing in early August and positioned their powerful warships to bombard the city. Facing this imminent threat, the destruction of Zhenjiang fresh in their minds, and the crippling disruption of the Grand Canal threatening famine in the north, the Daguang Emperor finally conceded. He authorized his officials to seek a negotiated peace.
And the treaty that followed, signed in Nanjing in August 1842, was a watershed moment, profoundly reshaping the relationship between China and the West and ushering in a new era of unequal treaties.
Signed aboard HMS Cornwallis on August 29, 1842, the Treaty of Nanking imposed a series of harsh and far-reaching conditions on the Qing dynasty.
What were the main terms?
China was forced to open 5 major ports: Guangzhou, Canton, Xiamen, Amoy, Fuzhou, Ningbo, and Shanghai to foreign trade and residents, effectively dismantling the restrictive Canton system.
And financial penalties.
They were also compelled to pay a substantial indemnity of 21 million silver dollars to the British government, a massive sum ostensibly as compensation for the destroyed opium, debts owed by Kuhong merchants to the British, and the costs of the war.
And territory.
Crucially, China was forced to cede the island of Hong Kong to Britain in perpetuity. It became a British crown colony.
What about opium? Was it legalized?
Interestingly, the treaty did not explicitly legalize the opium trade. Palmerston had wanted that, but Pottinger decided against pushing for it, perhaps seeing it as too controversial or difficult to enforce. However, the treaty did nothing to curtail it, and the flow of opium into China continued, arguably even increased, under the new conditions.
How is this treaty remembered in China?
For 20th century Chinese nationalists, the year 1839, marking Lin Zexu's crackdown, became symbolically viewed as the beginning of a century of humiliation at the hands of foreign powers. And many historians consider the First Opium War and the Treaty of Nanking as the true starting point of modern Chinese history, marking a decisive shift in the global balance of power and the beginning of China's forced integration into a Western-dominated world system.
It's clear that the British held a significant technological and tactical advantage throughout the war, which proved decisive in their victory.
The technological superiority of the British Royal Navy was undeniable. Their steam-powered gunboats, like the infamous HMS Nemesis, were far more maneuverable and powerful, especially in riverine warfare, than the Qing dynasty's traditional sailing junks.
Better ships, better guns.
The British ships were generally better built, better armed with more accurate and longer-range cannons firing explosive shells, and their naval tactics, honed through years of global warfare, were far more advanced. Coordinated maneuvers, disciplined gunnery.
Things the king couldn't match.
The Qing Navy simply had no effective counter to these technological advancements. Their ships were outgunned and outmaneuvered consistently.
And the Qing forces on land, despite their numbers and often their bravery, were hampered by outdated technology, inferior weaponry, and a fundamental underestimation of the British capabilities and their willingness to wage war.
You're right. The Qing military largely relied on outdated firearms matchlocks, mostly, alongside bows and arrows and spears, plus relatively primitive artillery and traditional naval vessels. Their tactics were often static and defensive, ill-suited to countering the swift amphibious assaults and aggressive maneuvers of the British forces.
And they misjudged the British response.
There was also that initial miscalculation within the Qing government, fueled by past experiences perhaps, that the British could be easily deterred or expelled like previous troublesome foreigners. This underestimation of the British military power and political will proved to be a fatal error.
The Treaty of Nanking, while ending the immediate conflict, didn't resolve all the underlying tensions, and in fact seems to have sown the seeds for future conflict. The aftermath section of our sources highlights this ongoing instability.
Absolutely. The Treaty of Nanking, despite its significance, failed to fully address the core issues that had led to the war, particularly from the British perspective regarding even wider trade access, diplomatic representation in Peking, and the still unresolved opium issue.
Leading to more war.
This dissatisfaction ultimately contributed to the outbreak of the Second Opium War, or the Arrow War, between 1856 and 1860, a further and arguably even more devastating conflict involving Britain and France against China.
And internal problems in China.
Furthermore, the social and economic disruption caused by the First Opium War, the indemnity payments, and the humiliation of defeat created an environment of instability. This served as a backdrop for the massive Taiping Rebellion, a devastating civil war starting in the 1850s that further weakened the Qing regime immensely.
Yeah, the other consequences mentioned?
Yes, the European trade in captive Chinese coolie labor, essentially indentured servitude under often brutal conditions, also saw a significant expansion in the wake of the war as ports opened up.
What about missionaries?
The unequal treaties that followed Nanking, like the Supplementary Treaty of the Bogue, also granted foreign missionaries greater freedom to operate within China and established extraterritoriality.
Extraterritoriality, what's that?
That meant foreigners accused of crimes in China would be tried by their own country's consular officials under their own laws, not by Chinese courts. It gave European powers legal jurisdiction over their own citizens and even some authority over Chinese Christians, further eroding Qing sovereignty.
Looking back at this pivotal conflict, there are various revisionist views among historians, offering alternative interpretations of its causes and significance beyond the traditional narrative, which often focuses solely on opium.
Indeed, historians have offered nuanced perspectives. Jasper Ridley, for example, argued that the conflict was an almost inevitable clash between what he saw as a corrupt, decadent, tradition-bound Qing empire and a dynamic, commercially driven, free-trading Britain, a clash of civilizations almost.
A different take focuses on British motives beyond just trade.
Glenn Mellencamp posited that the war was primarily about Britain defending its national honor and its commitment to the principles of global free trade, especially amidst other international pressures Britain was facing. It wasn't just about forcing opium, but about forcing China to conform to British ideas of international relations.
And the American view you mentioned.
John Quincy Adams, former U.S. president, famously argued back then that opium was merely incidental, the trigger perhaps, but the fundamental issue was China's refusal to engage in diplomatic relations on an equal footing, symbolized by that whole kowtow controversy. The core was diplomatic equality.
Other views look more internally at China.
Ray Huang's analysis emphasizes deep structural problems within the late Qing dynasty: economic strain, bureaucratic inefficiency, social unrest, which weakened its ability to effectively respond to the external threat, making conflict more likely regardless of the specific trigger.
And another view comparing it to the Boston Tea Party.
Harry G. Gelbard drew that parallel, suggesting that while opium served as the immediate trigger, like tea in Boston, the underlying causes were broader. Perceived Chinese military threats to foreign civilians, the denial of diplomatic equality, and the severe limitations placed on international trade through the Canton system. Opium was the spark, not the whole fire.
And the enduring question remains, could the First Opium War have been avoided? Was it an inevitable clash, or were there missed opportunities for peaceful resolution?
The question of inevitability is a complex one, debated by historians. China's consistent refusal to engage in diplomatic relations on equal terms, as exemplified by the repeated rejection of British embassies like Macartney's and Amherst's, certainly made finding a peaceful resolution incredibly difficult from a Western perspective.
And the British economic drives.
Michael Greenberg argued that the powerful momentum behind overseas trade in Britain's rapidly expanding industrial economy made some form of confrontation aimed at opening markets almost unavoidable. The pressure was immense.
But maybe war wasn't the only option.
It's also important to remember that the pro-war faction in Britain wasn't initially dominant. The Melbourne government faced numerous other pressing international issues. As Glenn Mellencamp argued, the issue of national honor became a significant factor in tipping the balance towards war, perhaps unnecessarily.
Are we overlooking Chinese agency?
Some historians also point out that focusing solely on British motivations overlooks crucial internal factors within the Qing dynasty. The Manchu rulers were often more preoccupied with internal unrest, rebellions, sectarian movements, and threats to their authority than with the distant barbarians.
Internal politics mattered too.
James Polacek suggests that internal factionalism within the king court, particularly among conservative scholars, focused on ideological purity and perhaps underestimating foreign power, led to poor decision-making and an underestimation of the likelihood and potential impact of foreign intervention.
Did Lin Zexu miscalculate?
Historian Jonathan Spence observed that both Lin Zexu and the Daoguang Emperor fundamentally misjudged the British government's willingness to protect the interests of its merchants, even those involved in smuggling. They didn't grasp how integrated those interests were with national policy and pride.
Why was Lin so determined, besides the silver drain?
Polacek also highlights the growing awareness within the king court of the devastating impact of opium addiction on the effectiveness of the military, particularly the Green Standard Army garrisoned in Guangdong. This fear of military weakening was a key driver behind Lin Zexu's forceful suppression efforts. But Lin mistakenly believed he could persuade or coerce the British to abandon the lucrative opium trade without provoking a full-scale war, a fatal miscalculation.
So for you, our listener, what are the key takeaways from this deep dive into the First Opium War?
Well, I think it's crucial to see this wasn't simply a trade dispute over one commodity. It was a monumental collision of two empires operating under vastly different worldviews, driven by fundamentally different economic systems, and holding irreconcilable understandings of international relations and diplomacy.
The roots go deep.
The seeds of this devastating conflict were sown over decades through a complex interplay of trade imbalances, deep-seated cultural misunderstandings, competing notions of sovereignty, and yes, the introduction of a highly destructive commodity, opium, which became inextricably linked with national interest and honor for both sides, tragically.
And the outcome.
The war itself, marked by Britain's decisive technological superiority, forcibly propelled China onto a path of profound internal upheaval and ushered in a period that would forever be etched in its national memory as one of deep humiliation and foreign exploitation.
And understanding this pivotal historical moment provides crucial context for grasping modern China's intricate relationship with the West and its enduring sensitivities regarding sovereignty, national pride, and historical grievances.
Absolutely. It underscores the profoundly destructive potential of the drug trade when entangled with state interests, and the inherent complexities and dangers that arise when intercultural interactions occur in the context of significant power imbalances and fundamentally different legal and diplomatic frameworks.
Consider this. What if, at any point in the decades leading up to the war, genuine and respectful diplomatic channels had been more effectively utilized? What if both the British and Qing empires had demonstrated a greater willingness to truly understand the other's perspective, their values, and their core interests, rather than talking past each other?
Could this devastating conflict, with its far-reaching and long-lasting consequences, have been averted? It's impossible to know for sure, but it's a vital question to ponder. And what if the focus of trade had remained on mutually beneficial goods, rather than a commodity as inherently destructive as opium? The questions that linger from this deep dive continue to resonate in our world today, shaping international relations and reminding us of the enduring impact of these historical events.
And on that thought, we bring this deep dive to a close. But before you go, consider this. The Treaty of Nanking was just the beginning of a series of unequal treaties that would further erode Qing's sovereignty.
Just the first domino, really.
Next time on History Unraveled, we'll delve into the Second Opium War, a conflict fueled by unresolved issues and a relentless push for even greater foreign influence in China. You might think you know the story, but what if the seemingly straightforward narrative of Western aggression masks a more complex web of internal Chinese struggles and shifting global power dynamics? Join us as we peel back another layer of history.